Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Content Matters podcast. We are in season 6. I can't believe 6 years of doing this podcast will be this year. It's been a really enjoyable time. And today, especially, we are episode 50. So that's a big kind of milestone for this podcast. So I thank everyone who has listened to us all along or has been kind of diving in and listening to us as we go along. Thank you very much for being a part of this journey with me and with Ingenix, who is the sponsor of the podcast. I think we have a great episode 50 for you today. We have Joe Gollner, who is the managing director of Gnostyx Research. Joe specializes in objective and research-based guidance on the development, management, and strategic use of content technologies. Content technologies, big, huge topic. In this field, he is a veteran with over 30 years of experience. And he likes to say he's well known for mixing leading edge ideas and, as he said, all too frequently concocting them with highly pragmatic implementation practices. So Joe's got a huge background of experience. He's got a great bio that I'm going to link you to that you can kind of hear all about that on the show notes. And he writes about content management, and he's actually pursuing his doctoral research in the role of AI-enabled text analysis in management and organizations. That's such a mouthful. Thank you, Joe, for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's great to be here, Barb.
Yeah, your bio is just crazy. I loved it. I actually loved it. Was human. It was so nice. Like, you've done so many different things, but then there's such a human aspect to it that it was really nice to read.
Yes, well, crazy is the operative word, yes.
Well, then we're going to have a crazy discussion today because our topic is Content 5.0. Are we ready for it? And I think you've got some really good ideas and information for our guests or our listeners today. So and I know you've got some slides that you're going to share to kind of help with kind of visually understanding some of the stuff that you're talking about. So if you want to get those up, we'll get ready and dive in.
Let's see here. There we go. This works.
All right, we're good to go. So Joe, first one out of the gate, we're going to hit it right off the top. What is Content 5.0? What does it mean? And how does it relate to Industry 5.0? And what the heck does Industry 5.0 mean?
Yeah, that's it's really what got me going, and it's great that we start with that topic because it challenges me and challenges us to sort of think about our terms. So so we'll go to the first slide here, which can help as a bit of context. So certainly, the Content 5.0 and Industry 5.0 sounds very new because it is. We were already struggling with the idea of Industry 4.0 and Content 4.0, and suddenly there's 5. So that seemed to be a good thing to focus on with this conversation, saying, okay, well, what on earth could 5 be? So what we can do is we'll just quickly double back to industry and Industry 4.0, which was something that came out of Germany. The sort of in German machining industry and sector almost had an industry consortium saying, well, let's think through the ideas of a fourth industrial revolution. And there's a lot of substance behind that. Like it's got some legs. It's just not crazy talk. And as I put here on one of the slides, you can go to the World Economic Forum, their Davos conference. Like people love talking about Industry 4.0. So what I did, and this is going back almost 10 years ago, I said, okay, if we have that concept, can we apply the same 4 levels to content? And what would that look like? And it's really just like a thought experiment. It's a challenge saying, can this apply? And if it does apply, does it do so usefully? So the Industry 4 levels are basically the Industrial Revolution starting in the late 18th century in England. Think of the steam engine, the introduction of steam power, the division of labor. Think of Adam Smith, all that good stuff. Basically, the beginning of industrialization. 2, think of Henry Ford and the Model T Ford. saying assembly lines, introduction of electricity in particular. And then 3, we see, let's say after World War II, you see the increasing sort of automation, introduction of computing into manufacturing, and early robots, or even just devices that basically could leverage human direction with more power. And that brings us to 4. And 4 is really about smart manufacturing, where the parts and the supply chains are very distributed. They're very clever. Basically, it's almost like assembly lines that can reconfigure themselves to build products and produce them, not just mass production, but mass customization. So I said, in fact, you can already tell that that's going to fit quite nicely with content.
Yeah.
And so so then, of course, just recently, and of course, I've even working on a book called Content 4.0, Human Knowledge in the Age of the Smart Machine, which, in terms of being buzzword compliant, hits all the buttons. But then, so I hear people talking about Content 5.0, Industry 5.0. I said, oh no, I have to somehow digest a new concept, drats. And so I've done just that. And I said, well, when you pick up something like this, like an Industry 4.0 model or rubric, or 5.0, you're suddenly put upon to say, well, how do you make it something worthwhile? And in particular, I've already worried about how if you have 4.0, someone wants 5, someone wants 6. Before long, we have 7.2, 11.4. It's like, okay, this gets silly at a certain point. So I said, well, can we think about the 4 levels in a way that once you get to 4, you basically have opened up all the channels and said, okay, now the magic can happen. There's no telling what's going to happen. And that's sort of what smart manufacturing was about. So I said, well, if you have to have 5, then we'll call it what emerges. It's maybe what we do with that capability. So again, in Europe, particularly out of the European Commission, just think Brussels, think bureaucrats. They thought, okay, we're going to create an Industry 5.0 and talk about really a better balance between industry and society, between computers or robots and people. So all that's fine, that's all heartwarming. It's not really. So some of the reviews of Industry 5.0 have been quite acerbic and critical, saying this is not an industrial revolution. And I'm kind of in that camp. It's kind of silly to leverage a phrase from Jeremy Bentham, from the early 19th century English philosopher. It's nonsense on stilts. But and we say, and at each of these levels of industry. So even with the first industrial revolution, even Adam Smith, the high priest and patron saint of the Industrial Revolution, was very conscious of the whole question of people, and things like moral sentiments, as he wrote a lot about, and the appearance of industry, and of course Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are world famous for their observations on Industry 1.0. But my favorite is a chap by the name of Robert Owen, who is a utopian socialist, even before Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels got to work. And what was interesting is he was an industrialist who immediately then set out to actually build more ideal communities in and around sort of an Industry 1.0. So he was, unlike the bureaucrats in Brussels, he actually set out to do it. So as I put here, he said he hears the people talking about Industry 5.0 and he says, hold my beer, been there, done that. And even actually just a couple of years ago, I was in the north of England and we visited a Quaker-owned cotton mill, which similarly was brilliantly designed with literally school, churches, small little medical support, and accommodations for all the workers. So there were people in the late 18th century, early 19th century giving good thought to the balance of people and machines. So all that to say is much of what is couched as brand new about Industry 5.0 is not so new.
Is
But
it is
yeah,
it sorry, is it kind of like, I kind of wonder if maybe they're saying that because with all the kind of conversations and stuff that's happening with generative AI and AI that they think that they're calling it something new because we have to really address the relationship between humans and AI even more so.
yes, yes, and I do, despite the hard line I just took, I then soften and say, if you really have to have your 5.0, then yes, you can put it as I put in this diagram as an overlay saying, and now we look at what we use all this capability for.
Right.
And it is quite, and so yes, definitely one of the motivations behind the champions of 5.0 is that they don't want to have the interest in AI and in sort of smart manufacturing just steamroll over the concerns about we'll call it the human centricity. How do we make this beneficial for people who are participating in the work and those affected by that work?
Right.
How to make it, the resulting systems more resilient, the whole thing more sustainable, more environmentally sensitive. These are all good things. So I did eventually say yes. It's quite fine to have that as sort of the follow-on discussion. It's not really an industrial revolution,
Mm.
but it is bringing forward very valid points. So I like calling it an emergent, saying once you have the capability, it's like, okay, smarty pants, what do you do with it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And back to your kickoff question, how does this possibly even remotely apply to content? And I've had a couple, and people who know me know that I have come at this a few times over the years, and this model has evolved a little bit. And so I would say, okay, well then what does it possibly mean to talk about, content 1.0? And I was very interested in saying, let's have a model of, 1 to 4 or 1 to 5. That doesn't mean that, oh, once you're at 2, you can look down your nose at 1, and so
Uh,
on and so forth. That I actually found I went back to what would be 1.0 that is absolutely fundamental, and I call it authentic content. Like, is it content, you know, that has sort of, we'll call it rhetorical intent or agency? Does it really express a perspective, and is it grounded? So we won't go into a lot of it, but I have a whole emergent theory around what content means, and it's crystallized in this idea of authenticity. Like, is it grounded? Is it networked in with knowledge precedent? Is it useful? You know, if you've got that, then you can build on it. Then you have something that's worth sharing through all your channels. It's worth optimizing with automation, and so on and so forth. But if you don't have that, you've got Zippo, you've got nothing to go on.
right.
So I find that quite attractive. And once we get to 4, we're talking about smart distributed content, where literally the content is we'll call it componentized or modularized. It's shareable in that sort of, we'll call it processing friendly form, so that perhaps you don't publish it. Your customer turns around and publishes it in their products. Um, or, in the extreme cases, which I've had projects where we've done these sorts of things where you don't publish it at all. It doesn't become a page that anyone reads. It becomes part of the product. So it's literally, as friends of mine at IBM said, it's like, whoa, it's like literate programming of reality, man. So
Okay. So then how do you put 5.0 into that kind of picture? Like what are you thinking of there?
yeah, yeah, and like the rant that we just ran through about Industry 5.0, saying, okay, if you really must have a content 5.0, then you can see it as sort of something that emerges atop the capabilities established by the 4 previous layers. It doesn't supersede them. It says, okay, so to your point, it's very interesting to be thinking about how people and machines can collaborate. So I put in this saying, it's interesting to think about, okay, what content starts to emerge as a collaboration between AI and authors, um, where some of it is being generated. So some of my projects today, and in fact, some of my projects 10 years ago were very interested in saying, okay, if we write this much content. What can AI then generate to add it, to sort of bulk it up and to sort of create other renditions or extrapolations that can then be useful to help people find things? So one is, for example, you've written a bunch of topics that are basically troubleshooting. You can actually have your AI agent say, okay, generate a library of questions to which these topics are a good answer. And this can be fed then to an AI chatbot agent that then says, when you are interacting with a person and they've got a problem, they ask questions or they're in a situation, you can use this library as one of your recognition points of reference. And that leads ultimately, you hope, to the people getting back to the maintenance or the troubleshooting topic that you wish they would read before they break the machine. Yeah.
Okay, that's true. All right. So, do you think that we're in this 5.0 already, or do you think we're still kind of somewhere between, do we need a 5.0 or do we really want to just stick with 4.0 like you're writing your book on? Are you actually going to go change your book title to 5.0?
Yeah, that is the $10,000 question, but it remains to be seen if I will adjust with the fashion. But you know, a topic I just proposed for a conference in the spring is actually it references William Gibson, the great science fiction writer from Vancouver, and his famous quote is, "The future's already here; it's just not evenly distributed."
Right.
So there are cases, even my experience, my professional experience, where we've been rocking all of these levels, and there are other cases where different organizations will be at different points of we'll call it evolution or growth. I do see one common pattern that we see, which is one of the reasons I've been emphasizing authenticity around level one, is that if I think back over the last 30 years, one of the things we've done sometimes in our mad rush to do multi or omni-channel publishing, we often tripped up authors. We actually made their life much harder and in some ways corrupted and poisoned their experience as authors and reduced, we'll call it, the authenticity, the rhetorical agency that they felt towards their content. And consequently, what we were delivering to all the new channels wasn't as good. So sometimes you'll see circumstances where we jump to 2 and forget about 1, and then the house of cards collapses. So it can be, again, the merit of having something like this, aside from giving Joe reasons to rant about theory and history, is that it can actually force you to think about questions quite practically and go, if we're going to do this, we better make sure we don't poison the well. We don't trip up our authors and make their experience suboptimal.
So are you kind of maybe I'm not understanding it right, but with content 1, 2, 3, 4, even 5, like those could all be happening right now at the same time, right? Like we're not in a future of moving to one version 1.0 to 2.0. It's like a company itself could be in version 1.0 still there, and another one could be way up to 5.0. It just depends on how they've recognized the importance of content strategy and content technologies in their company, right?
Exactly, and it's I really wanted a model where it was cumulative, that because I remember the first time I gave a talk about 10 years ago about Content 4.0, there were some people from a very large company that will go nameless, who then raced up to me afterwards and then followed me around the conference. I felt like the green eggs and ham guy, in that they were always showing me the latest prototype they had, saying, "Are we 4.0? Have we achieved 4.0?" In other words, they saw it as completely progressive. Once you were 4, then 3 was so last year, and you don't even want to talk about 2. And I said, well, I wanted a model saying, no, you don't have 4 if you don't have 1.
Right.
That it really is cumulative. And in which case, yeah. But you sometimes, and you still encounter organizations that are using very retro technology and so old school, old practices. So you might say, really, you are 1.0. You basically just print this off and hand it to somebody. But the content is good. I said,
Yeah.
so you're a solid one.
So that's all kind of comprised of content strategy, right? Is a big part of it.
Well, exactly. And it's thinking about, well, what content do you want? What, why do you want it? And in what form does it have to come together ultimately? Like what's the big picture? Who's going to get it?
Yeah.
Who cares? And if it is, say, you know, customers or prospects who are going to interact with you across a very long life cycle, and they're going to perhaps interact with you in many different ways, then that tells you a lot about what kind of content and basically how it is you're going to work on it. And we then look to content ops being the world in which, okay, somebody's got to do this, and they've got to do it on a daily, weekly basis.
Yeah.
And um, and then, of course, it also encourages to say, and my big thing is, okay, the technology. What are the technologies that can be put in place to make this all sustainable?
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay. So, you've kind of had some provocative statements in the past that said that content strategy, most of what passes for content strategy today has nothing to do with content and even less to do with strategy. So, before we get into content technologies, let's talk about that part of it. What did you mean by that, or what do you mean by that?
Yes. Provocative is the word. And by saying that, I was basically observing that oftentimes when I would hear people talking about content strategy, this is not always true, but oftentimes I would find that they associated with a definition of concept or of content or a concept of content that was unsatisfying. It said, well, it doesn't really help us very much. So they were either using the term as a euphemism or as a synonym for information, stuff we put out there.
Right.
Or in some strange cases, they said, it's life, the universe, and everything. It's like, oh, well, okay, great. I don't know what we're going to do with that. Um, I tend to be quite precise in my definition of content as potential information. It's basically technology is a key part. We only really started to think about content when the web, or even before the web, CD-ROM publishing came up, and suddenly our content had to be in more formats than one. It
Right.
wasn't just print a book.
Yeah.
And as soon as that happened, we said, oh, well, now we have to think about our content separate from any of the delivery channels. And the technology forced us to acknowledge that content is a little different than the information experiences we are then going to produce. And really the early 90s is when that happened. And so I find, so the content strategy, I'll see things going around about it saying, well, what content are you actually talking about? And then two, to complete the punishment and to make sure I get in absolute trouble, I'd say, but are we thinking about the word strategy in a way that the enterprise strategists are using it? Like, are we actually talking about our strategy in a way that is similar to and plugs into the way the business stakeholders are thinking about strategy? And
Right.
the answer there is often no. Um,
So how do you kind of bring those two together then? Like if content strategy is kind of broken, how do you see changing it and kind of making that business correlation actually happen?
yeah, yeah. Well, I do, and like all like the work on the 1 to 4 or now to 5 content rubric, or other work that I've done over the years, it's about saying, okay, well, if we are intentional in how we use the word content, and then how we talk about, and I'll go to another slide here, the concept of content strategy, content operations, content engineering.
Hmm.
If we're intentional, we can actually start making a lot of sense, and we can engage the larger business and technology community on their terms and in ways that they recognize. So one of the problems that the content community has always had is, fighting for scraps, fighting for, a little bit of respect. I remember 15 years ago, I wrote a a blog post while sitting drinking wine in a college room in Oxford about content management being the Rodney Dangerfield of technologies. We get no respect. And one of the reasons was we're not clear on what it is we're managing. We're not clear about how we plug into business strategy, how we don't approach it with the same kind of discipline that you see when we go into study management and business.
Yeah.
But we can fix that. And I think starts with good definitions of what we mean by content, a clear understanding of what is the job, the technologies, whether it's a content management system, the publishing tools, the authoring environment. What do we really need that to do to help us do content that is authentic and worth sharing, that's worth having an AI learn from? Otherwise, instead of it going crazy, these are really valuable things. And I find that if we approach our work and our discussions with that kind of discipline, I personally find suddenly then the business stakeholders go, okay, all right, I hear what you're saying. You're here to play, and you suddenly are in a much different conversation when it comes to, say, budgets and so on, which is a good place to be. So.
Yeah. So this is content strategy, content operations, content engineering. The three of them have to kind of work together. And if they work together the right way, you kind of move up those levels of content 1.0, 2.0, and so on.
Absolutely, exactly. And in fact, even these three pieces kind of map to my 1, 2, 3 levels. And so, again, showing just how crazy Joe can get. One of the areas I go back to is with computer-aided manufacturing. There was a modeling standard which was called IDEF, came out of the U.S. Air Force of all things. Brilliant work, brilliant. And in fact, it's become embedded in the way that businesses think about their strategy. When you think about value process modeling or mapping, it all comes from IDEF. And so I say, well, in IDEF, we basically have a couple of moving pieces. Strategy are basically, the controls. What is it you're trying to do, and how do you know you're doing it? Operations, the processes, what goes in, what comes out, and who does it, who's responsible. And then engineering, what we call the mechanisms. How do you actually support this with tooling so they don't go crazy? And as you and I were sort of corresponding back and forth preparing for this, talking about how content is hard. Content is really hard. It is hard work. and content professionals, the people who are probably listening to us here, they work really hard. And what I see is systems, all types of systems, are getting bigger and bigger, more and more complex, more and more integrated, interoperating with more and more. So the job of things we need to understand and articulate is just exploding in scale. So it's good thing AI showed up when it did, because we were going to just burst into flames. As I sometimes say, Jack Kerouac can type fast, but he can't type that fast. Like, how do you keep up with all this? Well, one of the answers is you put in place this kind of approach, saying, what's the strategy? Who's going to do it? How are you going to proceed through the work? And from, I'm biased. My specialty is the technology. What tooling can you put in place that's going to help people? And today that very much involves, how do we enlist AI in a constructive, collaborative way? So back to our 5.0, how do we actually interact with this technology in a way that's going to be, that's going to actually make things easier? It's going to, for the people working on the content and for the people using it.
And I think part of that is that there was kind of, for a long time, this idea that you could use one content repository or content management system to manage all your content. And that just doesn't happen. Content is everywhere. And you have to figure out how it all works, connects, and plays together to work properly.
That is it. So the phrase you'll see on this slide on the bottom end is content ecosystem. because the content, frequently parts of it are managed and live almost its entire life in all kinds of business applications. And so it's almost never the case that everything is in one system.
Yeah.
And so that's very much the case. And I remember back in about 1993 or so, one of the content management system vendors, and they still exist, impressively, came to visit me in the military to basically use us as an initial test case, and it's almost like a focus group for their content management. But they were focused on a very small group. And I said, well, we got a problem here, because we're looking at the supply chain for a big system, a big NATO system with 10,000 suppliers. So what the heck are you talking about? We need to be able to manage the content across all of these companies, and it has to flow up and down that supply chain. So you're never going to be talking about one system. You're going to talk hundreds, if not thousands, of systems collaborating and sharing content. So I said, that is content management.
Yeah. So how do you do that though? Like, we have our content strategy, we have our content technologies. Do the technologies have to come first before you can build the right strategy?
That's a really good question, and it's an interesting dynamic. And so you'll sometimes say, nope, the strategy is pure. We can create it in the clouds and say, and not the cloud. I mean, in imaginative clouds, and then the world has to bow to our plans.
Right.
We go, well, does that make sense? Does that really sound like what happens? No. So there is a complex interaction between what it is you want to do, the tools that are available to you, and who's participating. So there's this, but I like to start with the strategy, but then say, one of the paths that I like to encourage is say, come up with a strategy, try it out, but actually use the tools you've got. Like perhaps work a little harder, try it out, and then think about the technology that's going to come in to help, expedite the things that you're working on. But understand the technology will then change things. And so in my own methodology, we talk about information prototyping and model implementation. So you can go through that process quickly and start to interact with the tools, knowing that now your strategy is going to change.
Yeah.
And this tells us a lot about the technologies and our approaches to the content. It has to be, the phrase we used to use in the military was max flex. You've got to be ready to change and evolve, because as soon as you touch the tools, what it is you're trying to change or do is going to change. And the thing we would always dread on projects, as soon as you went through the first series of investments, then someone on the business side would say the dreaded, this changes everything. Or, oh, does this mean we can? Oh, darn. And then, so if you know that's coming and you can approach it with your eyes open, then you welcome it rather than dread it.
Right. And do you think are content strategists right today, are they more pure content people as opposed to the technology part of it, or is that a different kind of role, or do they have to have both? I think they do, but do they today, and how does that work?
That's a great question. So one way to look at it is that all the sort of participants here say a content strategist needs to be cognizant of the technology, but they may not be a content technology specialist. And the same is true of the content technology specialist. They may not be, dyed-in-the-wool strategists, but they need to be conscious of how they're going to fit it. So in principle, and I flatter myself that sometimes I can be all three, but really, when I say really, Joe, no, I'm typically too far removed from we'll call it the sharp end of what content and who's consuming it. I will typically step back and say, no, I bring the tech. I caused the trouble. You're welcome. I said, I will make things a mess, but that's my contribution. I will bring the technology that changes the things as a team. So the real answer is it's always teamwork. that you
Right.
will find people who are the content strategists. And if anything, their biggest obligation is to really connect with, well, the business strategy, to sort of bring that sharp edge to play. Content ops can be closer to, we'll call it, the editorial strategy, but then they interact with content strategy. And the technology side, you have to be very wired into the technology strategy of an organization, its infrastructure, its game plan, its rules, because you have to plug in. And if anything, I find one of the areas where we fall down in the content business is not being as well integrated into the big picture as we could be.
Right. I find too that when I hear people talk about content strategists and content strategy, that it tends to be more of a discussion when you get to technical documentation, and less so. It's a different type of content strategy when you start talking about marketing and sales content. But it should really be all together because it's the content strategy for the organization, regardless of the type of content that you're dealing with.
Yes, yes, and just in the last few years, I also got into trouble by coming down very hard on the little silos that we've created in content. You know,
Mm,
we have Marcom over here, we have business communication proposals and whatnot here, and then we have TechCom over here, and we've built up little stacks around each so that we don't actually get that that synchronization. And I said, but it's the same person who's going to interact with all of these, and it is a missed opportunity to not have them better integrated.
yeah. But I think also a huge challenge for companies too.
Oh, yeah, yeah. There's no belittling the challenge, the magnitude of the challenge, and that if you're going to have almost like an enterprise content strategy that encompasses all of these and tries to coordinate the experiences across these business functions as well as sort of the channels, then it's even more challenging.
All right. Okay. Last question, because I mean, we could probably talk all day about how to implement, design, think about content strategy. But this question I wanted to ask you, you talked about this concept of barnacleization. And can you explain what that means as it applies to content strategy, content technologies? And does your vision or ideas of Content 4.0 and Content 5.0 kind of make that go away, or is that just a challenge we're going to have to deal with?
Yeah, yeah. So barnacleization was a concept I introduced actually almost exactly 25 years ago, which is shocking and terrifying. And basically, the idea when I was studying big systems at the time, and I wondered why does big software decay? How come it gets worse? Um, and I found that it wasn't because people weren't doing their job or that there were evil actors at play. It's because people were constantly adding new pieces, new beneficial contributions, which accumulate but then combine to degrade the system. So
Right.
barnacleization is really the accumulation of individually beneficial contributions that together degrade the system. It's like a ship gets so many barnacles on it, eventually it sinks.
Right.
And this has been remarkably well received. You know, people as different as lawyers and software engineers go, that's exactly what happens. That's it.
Yep.
And it's like, okay, well, um, I see that if you use content well, if you sort of put all this stack that we have on the slide here together and say, we're going to create organizational assets that are grounded and clear and accessible, we can use those to describe complete systems from a much more holistic and we'll call it life cycle focused. And this is really the only answer to barnacleization, so that you are really managing the system and not just the feature du jour. And that's one of the things that you really use, Content 4.0 for. So yes, I see a good approach to content and it being fully integrated into organization is the only vaccine against barnacleization.
So much stuff to know about content, content strategy, content technologies. I love the term content engineering. I think you said that you created that. I love that one. I think that's a great
Well,
term.
it does predate me, but there are those who have accused me of being the father of content engineering, and I have not fully been able to escape that accusation.
All right. Okay, well, speaking of being a father, this is my very final question for the day. I like to kind of surprise my guests with a silly question at the end. You are a father of sons and daughters, I believe. You've had to be a certified hockey trainer to play with your sons and a dance dad to dance with your daughters. So my question for you is, which was harder to do, to learn to play and teach hockey, or to get up on a stage with your daughter and dance?
Well, that's easy. The dance was much harder. Both are a lot of work, and strictly speaking, the work with the hockey teams, especially the first aid and stuff, was quite demanding. Turns
Yeah,
out,
I bet.
but the dance being really an alien environment, and dance is hard. Like I think one of the virtues of having dance dads was that it acquainted us with just how demanding and how intellectually demanding, not to mention physically demanding, dance can be. Like they would train us for months and we would be terrible. And we knew we were the comic relief. You literally heard 1,000 people in the auditorium screaming with laughter. We were that bad. And my daughters, I have 3 daughters, all accomplished dancers. They could basically talk some esoteric dance language and learn a number literally like that. And it's like, obviously they did rehearse and train, but they could, if necessary, pick up a number and go. And here we were, the dads, in just a disaster. And also, dance is tough. And our joke was, if you think hockey dads are tough, wait till you meet dance moms.
I have a son who played hockey. He doesn't play anymore. He's out of that. And a daughter who dances. And he likes to tell her that dance is not a sport. And she just goes crazy because, oh my God, that the work that they put into doing the stuff they do is just, it's a sport, and it's a very demanding sport.
Oh yes. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's amazing, especially with ballet. And the school that we were associated with was a very accomplished ballet school. So you became. Now I'm a tough audience. If I go to a dance performance, I will react very badly if I see floppy feet or bad turnout. I'm like, oh, this is terrible.
Oh, thank you, Joe. This has been a great conversation. Lots to go back and think about content 4.0 and content 5.0 and how I kind of apply that to the work that I do. It's been very insightful. Thank you.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. And thank you to Ingenix, the sponsor of the Content Matters podcast. Ingenix is a leading provider in web content management and customer experience technologies. And they've been in the industry for over 20 years, so they know quite a bit of stuff about digital experience and innovative content technologies. So I would suggest you visit their website if you want to know more about them: web content management, technical documentation, publishing, customer experience portals, ingenix.com, and head over there and sign up for the newsletter to find out more about the podcasts that are coming up in the coming months, because we've got a great lineup of the next 6 months. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day.